Good morning, everyone. I think we're about ready to start. Well, good morning. My name's Jessica Best. I'm engagement editor and operations lead for the Dutch journalism platform, De Correspondent. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thanks so much for getting out of bed and coming to the early session. The first thing you might notice The first, better? The first thing you might notice this morning is that I am incomplete. That isn't some sort of admission as part of the group therapy, but that I was supposed to be here with my colleague, Maaike Goslinga. She sends her apologies. Unfortunately, she had a family bereavement at the start of the week, and she wasn't able to make it to Perugia. She wishes she was here, and she said to apologize to you all. But it means that I'm extra glad that this is a group therapy session, because I don't feel quite so alone in taking this on. So if you guys can help me through this, that would be much appreciated. So what are we doing this morning? We're doing group therapy with the correspondent, and we're going to talk about learning from our mistakes, and hopefully we're going to talk about learning from your mistakes too. Over the next 4 days in Perugia, I'm sure you'll see a whole ton of inspiring stories about best practices from across the industry, interesting projects that have gone really well, and also lots of discussions about the challenges that the industry faces. But at a lot of these events, I think that we're not especially good at talking about the things that we screwed up, the things that we got wrong. They happen quietly away from the public eye, and we tend not to talk about them again. So we decided we wanted to do something a little bit different and talk about the things that we screwed up. We think we can learn just as much from this as we can from examples of best practice. This is going to be an interactive session. I'm going to ask you guys to talk to each other, and hopefully I'm going to ask you to talk to the group. So I'm going to offer up an amnesty now that if you've arrived here under some illusion that you won't be asked to participate, you can quietly sneak off right now and no one will mind, and go and see Jeff Jarvis talking down the hall. That's fine. Speak now. Good. Okay, you're all mine now. That's wonderful. Just a couple of ground rules to get things started. The first is that if you want to say who you are and where you work in this session, then great, go for it. If you don't, that's also fine. That might help in sometimes admitting some of the mistakes that you've made if you feel that you don't want to kind of reveal too much about where you're working. So feel free to keep that to yourself if you want. And the second thing is that what happens in group therapy stays in group therapy. So if somebody tells you something, please treat it with the confidence that you would treat a good friend sharing something with you. We want this to be really useful for you. So go ahead and share deeply and broadly, and know that you're doing so in confidence as well. I'm not a psychologist, so you're probably thinking, how on earth have I got the expertise to run this sort of session? And I don't, which is why I didn't do it on my own. This guy here is Jasper Jurphaas. He is a De Correspondent member, and he's a psychosocial therapist. He does group workshops all the time. He works on just this kind of thing, looking at people's mistakes and what can we learn from them. He helped us design this session. He put together the exercises to try and find ways that we can talk about the professional mistakes we've made, share them with one another, and take something away from them. He really said that the first thing that we should do is share with one another. So I'm actually not going to talk about De Correspondent until the end of the session, which hopefully also means that you'll stay. So the setup for the session will be, we're going to start with some exercises for the first sort of half an hour, 40 minutes. And then for the second half of the session, I will return the favor wholeheartedly by sharing with you a whole slew of things that we've got wrong at De Correspondent. And hopefully we can learn from both sessions. Sound all right to everyone? No one too scared about doing this? No? Good. Okay, so the first exercise is designed to do 3 things. The first thing is to get us comfortable with saying the things that we regret, the mistakes that we've made in our professional lives. You can share a personal mistake if you like, but the purpose of being here is to share our professional mistakes. The second thing it's designed to do is to move us from thinking about the mistake we've made to what we learn. So the thing when we were talking with Jasper was that when we make mistakes and when we have regrets, we ruminate on the thing that went wrong. But the most valuable thing is to look at actually what we took from it. And the third thing we want the exercise to do is to help you realize the importance or the opportunities there are in a change of perspective. So the way you saw your mistake is almost never the same way that the person next to you will see your mistake. So this is what we're going to do. We want you to get into pairs with someone you didn't come here with. So if you're sitting next to someone you know, turn behind you or go in front. And we want you to do this 4-step exercise. So choose a person 1 and a person 2. Person 1, this is designed to get us comfortable. This is what we like doing, bragging. Share a high point of your career, something that you're really proud of. That's the easy part. The next thing we want you to do is share a low point. It doesn't have to be the biggest mistake you've ever made, although if you feel comfortable with sharing that, that's awesome. But share a mistake that you've made or a regret that you have, something that went wrong in your work. Person 2 again, Then person 2, I want you to tell person 1 what you think they learned from that mistake or what you would have learned from that mistake so you can have a think about their perspective. And then person 1, share what you think you learned from that mistake. I'll leave the steps on the board because there's a few of them. Is that clear? Is that okay for everyone? We're going to have about 15 minutes for this. I'm going to do it too, so I'm going to pick on someone in the front row to come and share with as well. And then we'll get back together and hopefully we'll share with the group as well. 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, everyone, time's up for exercise 1. Time's up for exercise 1. I don't want to stop people's conversations. It's lovely to see you all talking. I was worried there was going to be complete silence when I did that. So thank you so much for talking to one another. And the good news is that everyone is human and everyone has made mistakes, lots of them by the sounds of all the time. So that's, that's great. We're going to revisit this exercise in a second with our feedback. But when I talk in the end of the session, when I talk about the mistakes that the correspondent has made, the reason we wanted to do this first was because a lot of the mistakes we've made have been internal. They've been to do with systems or processes, or they've been to do with relationships between teams. And so thinking a little bit about the things that we've done and the roles that we play is a really important learning process for us. But with the second exercise that we want to do this morning, it's much more about what we learn from other people. And with the correspondent, the way I'm going to talk about this in a little bit is what we learn from members. But this is the way that we'd like you to do this morning. This is what Jesper suggested we do to think a little bit about where else we can learn from. So we can get into groups again. You can do maybe little bigger groups if you like this time, 3 or 4. Name someone that you've learned from. What qualities did they have that allowed you to learn from them? And importantly, what context did they provide that facilitated that learning? So what situation did they create? What circumstance did they give to you that made it possible for you to learn something new from them? And most importantly, if you could speak to that teacher now, what would you let them know about what you learned from them? And again, we'll take around 15 minutes for this, and then we'll come back together. And I hope some of you are going to share with the group some of the things that you've talked about. Okay, off you go. Okay, everyone, it's time to come back together, please. Okay, if everyone's ready, we can move through to the reflection section as well. Cool. Okay, I just want to see by show of hands, who shared something today with somebody they had never met before this session? Who shared something with somebody they had never met before this session? Yeah, good. You never met before? Cool. That's what we were hoping, that you would feel comfortable enough to do that. I'm now going to ask you to do the same again. What I would really like is if a few brave souls would share with the wider group a couple of the things that you talked about in your groups or in your pairs. So if we can... if we can start with the first exercise, does anyone have a mistake that they've made that they would be willing to share with the group and that they think others could learn from as well? Anyone? Yeah? 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 You will? Go for it.
My name is Anushka. I'm from Slovenia. Oh, sorry. Hi, my name is Anushka. I'm from Slovenia. I have this, it's been 10 years ago, right? Yeah, we just realized it was 10 years ago. I wrote a 3-page article and I made a mistake in, I guess I didn't verify something well enough and it was literally half of a sentence in 3 pages. And the ethics court of the Journalism Association that we have in Slovenia basically, of course, found that I breached ethics rules. And to this day, I die inside when I say it out loud. But it's true, it happened. And of course, what it did for me was that, you know, I'm verifying everything 10 times since then, and it's never happened again. But, you know, it did happen. I'm guilty. I was guilty.
Thank you. It's weird, but I love that someone in our session said, I die inside when I think about it. This is great.
But I'm still alive.
Yes, we are still here. Excellent. Is there anyone else who would follow a wonderful example and share a mistake that they made? You don't have to say, I died inside. Yeah.
My first job was working at a radio station, and I was very bored. I had to, was in the studio, and I was very curious because the whole station was run on a computer. And I was very bored, and I started just pressing random keys on the keyboard, Control-Alt-Shift-J, Control-Alt-Shift-R. Somehow, I managed to make the whole radio station play nothing but advertising for 3 days straight. And that was how I lost my first job in media.
Oh, round of applause for that one, please. Wonderful, thank you very much. Do we have one more perhaps on this one? Any mistakes that people have made? Yeah, down at the front here? Down here. So.
Yeah. Well, as a journalist, sometimes you bump into scenarios where you can actually present your work, and that was the case, or that still is the case, with an exhibition that we're hosting in Berlin, 1st of May, which is like 2 weeks from now, and it's a very short-term opportunity, and we have a partner who is very ethereal in her way. She is very difficult in understanding what the real journalistic issues are, and I knew that, but I kind of really let this go, and I'm very, very sorry for that. But it kind of destroyed the opportunity of having this exhibition. So I'm trying to work around this right now, and saying this right now into the TV, or into the camera. Maybe it's going to be not broadcast, but on the website, and she can see it. I'm really feeling sorry for that. So.
Lovely. I'm a mistake and a live appeal. I love it. Great, thank you so much. That was wonderful. That was more than I could have asked for. With the second exercise, which was to think about how we can learn from other people, does anybody have someone that they have learned from? And it can be someone who they admire and will learn from because they think they're a fantastic person, or it can be someone they don't like, which was the example I shared with Emily and Richard over there, which was my first boss, was one of the worst people I came across professionally, but she taught me so much about how to deal with different types of people, and she really made me grow a backbone, and I'm super grateful to her for that. Hopefully what happens in group therapy stays in group therapy, and she's not here. But I would tell her that if I saw her. So does anybody have a person that they admire, or something that a person they were taught by that they'd like to share? Anyone? No? One here? Yes, a brave soul here. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Andreas from Austria. I just have a really smart-ass colleague. He's one of the smartest persons I know. And I always admired the way he writes, the way he thinks about topics, because for him there are no problems, there are only solutions. And I don't know, we debate a lot of topics in our daily job, and he's very inspiring, and I learned a lot from him. So if you hear this, Andras, I love you.
Thank you. We have any other declarations of love or otherwise? Yeah, one there? Yeah, we'll do one here and then we'll...
My first boss asked me, I was just sharing this with the group. I think a month in, I was a dropout from an engineering program, so I wasn't a typical interview for her. I had to make the case for going through 2 extra assessments to get into the job. And so because I was an unconventional hire for her, 2 months into the job, she asked me to be the first interviewer for a lot of positions senior to me in the organization. And what that meant was I had to do a lot of homework to not come across as an idiot in these sessions and ask valid, relevant questions. But what I realized later, she was also testing for the senior roles coming in was, would they get thrown off by having to work with someone younger to them or slightly less experienced with them in a project that the younger person or more inexperienced person was leading. Down the line, it helped me work with some really savvy engineers who were working on stuff that was fancy that I knew nothing about. And I picked up a lot from them because I didn't have, there was less ageism in the interaction. It was less about, whether you have 10 years of experience or 3 years. It was more about whether you understand the problem and can solve it or not. My name is Nasser. I'm from India.
I think we just had one more at the front here. Was Samantha there? Yeah? Cool.
I work for a couple of very smart people, brilliant people, actually many of them, more than just a couple. And they know a lot, and they've experienced a lot. And what I respect most and have learned most from them is to say, I don't know. They say, I don't know. Not a lot, but it matters when they say it. And they're not trying to bullshit anyone. And it creates this atmosphere immediately of trust and equality, and people aren't trying to prove something and just kind of lie their way through something. They're very upfront with what they don't know.
And that's really what this exercise was designed to do, is to help us be braver in saying what we don't know. It's a hard thing to do, and it's something that is right at the core of the philosophy of the Correspondent, and I think there's a real power in doing it. And thanks so much for entering into this so wholeheartedly. I think it makes for a much more interesting session if we all talk to one another rather than me just talking to you for an hour, so thank you very much. But I am now going to repay the favor for you sharing so extensively and talk a little bit about the ways we've screwed up at the Correspondent. Way number one. So I'll give a brief introduction to what the Correspondent is, what we do, for those of you who don't know or perhaps don't know very much. The Correspondent is a Dutch online journalism platform. We're based out of Amsterdam. We were launched in 2013 following a record-breaking crowdfunding campaign. We raised $1.7 million from around 20,000 backers, which enabled us to launch an in-depth, independent journalism platform. In 2018, we have 60,000 paying members. They pay 70 euros a year or €7 a month. We employ 47 full-time staff, which includes 21 full-time correspondents. The other people on staff are developers, graphic designers and illustrators, copy editors, editorial support, those kind of people. We reach around 2 million people each month. And we also have an in-house publishing business for our correspondents to publish their own books, and we've sold around 100,000 books, and they've all been bestsellers in the Netherlands. So what is our proposition? What was our proposition in 2013 when we asked people to back a non-existent platform? And what is our proposition today? We're an antidote to the daily newsgrind. That's our slogan. That's probably, if you know us, that's something you will have seen in English or in Dutch. We swear off breaking news. We don't cover the day-to-day news events. We like to say we cover the climate, not the weather. So this is context, this is analysis, this is investigative reporting that's looking to give our readers and our members a better understanding of the world around them, and also to help them make decisions in their lives as well. So it's to empower them. We're completely ad-free. We are funded by our members. That means that we don't chase clicks, and that means that we don't have to sell our members to advertisers. We give our correspondents room to run. This means that so our correspondents work on a beat basis. Their beats are self-defined, so beats include things like we have an aging correspondent, we have a mobility correspondent who looks at transport and biking and how we use cars. We have a social development and conflict correspondent. So these are experts in their field who choose what they want to write about, and then they work with our members to decide the particular stories that they develop. And we also treat our members as curious individuals who actively participate. Our starting point is always that our members know more than we do. So we always want to bring them into the process. We never say, should we include our members in the reporting of this story or the discussion around this story? It's just, how do we do it? So it's never a question of if. And I'll give you a couple of examples of the ways we've done this. This is one you may be familiar with. This is Jelmer Mommers, who's our energy and climate correspondent. He's been working on something for a couple of years now called the Shell Files. This is a really good example of how we appeal directly to members to help us report our story. 2 years ago, Jelmer thought we always talk about Shell employees, we never talk with them. So he just put this call out: "Dear Shell employees, let's talk." He had dozens and dozens of responses, and it led to around 20 interviews with people who either currently worked for Shell or used to work for Shell. And what our correspondents do is they use what we call a public notebook to share this process as they're doing it. So they say what they want to report on, and then they keep people updated as they're covering that story. We call it sharing the learning curve. So this was the original call out. He shared the transcripts of his interviews as he did them. And in the end, it resulted in a great scoop a year ago where he got hold of a video that showed, an internal Shell video that showed exactly how much they knew about climate change in the 90s. And he just had a second scoop from this last week with a whole load of documents from the 80s, which again showed how much of the risks Shell knew and how little they did about it. This is another project that shows how that we report with our members. We actually, not only do they become sources like they did in Shell, and as is common practice, but actually they do some of the reporting for us. This was a public a public interview initiative. So we asked our members, around 300 of them, to pair up with a refugee in their community and interview them once a month over a period of 6 months to actually find out what life is like for them coming to a new country. Again, we talk a lot about refugees in the media, but we very rarely talk with them. And this was also a way to bring communities together as well as just report on what life is like. It resulted in dozens of stories and new relationships within the communities of our members. Members, they might help in other ways such as proofreading, they might do fact-checking for us, and of course we have a very lively what we call contribution section. We deliberately don't call it a comment section below stories because you comment on something whereas you actually contribute to, and that's what we're trying to do. These sections are super vibrant, not only because we try to raise the quality of the debate, but because our correspondents are very, very active in those areas as well. It's a conversation back and forth between the member and the correspondent, so the process doesn't just stop when the piece is published. We're super proud of what we've done in the Netherlands, but our ambitions have always been a little bit bigger than Amsterdam. So a year ago, we announced that we were going to expand into the English language, but launching a journalism platform in a nation of 17 million people is a slightly different challenge to launching it to a global audience of English-speaking people. So we knew we couldn't do this alone. And for that reason, we partnered with NYU, and we've been working on something that a lot of you may be familiar with, which is the Membership Puzzle Project. Emily, director of the project, is sitting in the corner just there. The Membership Puzzle Project is a year-long research project that seeks to answer a few key questions around membership in news. So the first was, what can other news organisations working in or who want to work in the news membership space learn from The Correspondent? What can The Correspondent learn from others who are working in that space? And the third and perhaps most important one was that if news organisations are going to be increasingly supported or sustained by direct reader support, what does the social contract look like between news organisations and their audiences? What are the best practices around that? And the idea for The Correspondent is that we can take all the things we're learning through that project, and I'd really, if you haven't before, encourage you to go to the website where loads of fantastic research has been published over the last year. We're going to take the learnings from that research and we're going to feed all of that into the launch of our English language platform, hopefully later in 2018, which will be The Correspondent. So this is all super positive for a session that is all about telling you about our mistakes. This is my version of telling you what we're proud of. And we were, Maaike and I were presenting at News Rewired in London a few weeks back, and someone tweeted, "The Correspondent is living the media dream." We were like, wow, cool. But of course, I don't think anyone's living the media dream. That's not the case, and we're really proud to be held up as a really good example of how to work with your members. But we make mistakes. It's been hard. It continues to be hard. And we wanted to kind of talk about those mistakes here for the first time, because it's certainly not all rosy all the time. So I'm going to go through 10 things that we've learned from our mistakes, and there's 10, but there are a lot more that we have learned over the course of the last 5 years, and then hopefully I'd be really open to answering any questions about those mistakes and others, and if anybody's around for the rest of the week, then I would be happy to share even more mistakes with you over a beer as well. Okay, here's what we've learned. So, this is the first lesson. Don't second guess what members want. And this is how we learned this. You might be familiar with this sort of thing. This is my year in review from Pocket for 2017. It tells me I read 190,000 words in 2017, which means that my Pocket is not quite the graveyard of links that I thought it was. That's 7 books. I was reading about tech, I was reading about sports and current affairs. We thought this was cool. Lots of people do this. Lots of sites do this. So we decided to do the same sort of thing for our members a couple of years ago. We sent them a summary of what they'd been reading for the year. They absolutely hated this. We received hundreds and hundreds of emails saying, I don't like this, I didn't ask for this, And also, you have promised to be a media organization who is careful with my data. We have a data minimalization policy, and they felt this was a really egregious breach of the kind of organization that we'd agreed to be. I was speaking to my colleague Van, who was there at this time, and she said people even cancelled their memberships over this. So this was a pretty serious screw up, and we had to, of course, send a begging letter apology and really think about jumping on the bandwagon. We thought this was cool, this was interesting, but we never even asked our members what they wanted. Was this something they needed? So we don't do things without asking if this is something that they want anymore. The second mistake that we made was assuming that everyone wants to work the way that we do. When we founded the Correspondent, we were like, this is an amazing idea, and everybody will want to work with members in a really open, free way, and it'll be wonderful. But of course, that's not the case. Lots of journalists actually don't want to do this. They're not used to operating in a way that shows their learning curve. They don't like the amount of time that working with members takes. And they're just not willing to make themselves vulnerable, which is a personal choice, and it's totally fine. But it meant that a lot of the time we were coming across great journalists that we really wanted to work with that just didn't want to work the way that we do. So the lessons that we learned from that was that working with members is way more difficult than you think, and not everybody can or wants to do it, but also that you will come across great writers that you have to let go, and that's okay. We get asked when we do these presentations a lot, well, if you encourage everybody, all of your members, to contribute fully and to give you all of their expertise, don't you just drown in stuff, and aren't you inundated with crap half the time? And at the beginning, we were certainly drowning. We were getting so much stuff back, we had no way to deal with it. And we really, this was a big mistake because we learned that we needed to find ways to deal with information overload. There are a few ways that we decided to try and do this. The first is that we realized the correspondents that we had at that point were spending up to 50% of their time engaging with members. It was a huge amount to take away from their reporting. But what we decided was that this was so crucial to the way that we want to run a news organization that 50% had to remain. And so we actually built it into the job. So no one felt this is taking away from my writing time. This is part of your job to engage. So that was the first thing we did. The second thing we did was to be really specific about the type of input we want from members. The mistake we were making over and over again was just, here's our story in whatever format we published it in, contribute, with nothing specific about how we wanted them to engage. So we quickly changed that. And at the moment, we're working to develop CMS features, systems that actually help, in a very practical way, our correspondents to deal with all of the information we get in. But we still haven't got this right. We're still working on it. Admit mistakes wholeheartedly. We've got this wrong on a number of occasions and in a couple of different ways. Like any outlet, and as you were talking about just here before, despite rigorous fact-checking and verification that we try to do, obviously, to the highest standard, mistakes slip through. They will do. And we had to work out how to be very open and honest when we made mistakes. We really screwed up on this one just reasonably recently when we published a story on the gender pay gap. The correspondent who wrote the story had completely misunderstood or misinterpreted the data that she was working with. And not only that, she hadn't acknowledged the limitations of the study in the first place. This really kicked off in the contribution section. People were furious. They were, that's a mistake. This is a mistake. They were really furious about the fact that this mistake had been made. And worse than that, the correspondent didn't even see what was going on in the contributions, so she felt she was being ignored. So not only has she made the mistake, we didn't care that members had pointed it out. We try to build in some new ways to stop this from happening. And the first is that whenever a correspondent story gets published, they get an immediate email notification to say, your story is live, it's time for that 50% that starts now, so that you don't miss when people are correcting you. The second is that we don't hide away corrections or clarifications on the digital equivalent of page 37. We put them in the body of the original story. We put what was originally there right next to the correction. It's not at the bottom. And we get our correspondents to explain how the mistake was made. So we want to admit those mistakes really wholeheartedly in the body copy. Another place that we've done this is much more to do with that we've made mistakes and we're trying to admit those wholeheartedly is to do with diversity in our newsroom. So a few years ago, despite what was seen at the time as a fairly radical way of building a news organization, Rob Weinberg, who founded the company, looked around and realized that it looked very much like every other news company, which is white men between the ages of 30 and 50. We really wanted to do something about this, and so we ran a number of stories on our site admitting that we had a problem with this and that we wanted to do better. We talked about it at conferences, and we didn't hide away. And then we tried to find ways that we could correct this. We made there were a few posts at the time that we announced that were open only to minority candidates. And we also introduced something called the Correspondent College, which is designed to bring people through the young aspiring journalists through the system from minority backgrounds, or people who aren't from traditional journalism backgrounds as well, which is often a blocker for people from minority backgrounds. So we were trying to admit what we do wrong and find ways to work with other people to make it better. This is a really quick one. Members won't visit every nook and cranny of your site. The mistake we made here was when we first launched, we decided that author profile pages were going to be hugely important, and we called them the rather horrendous name of author gardens. They were going to be where our reporters shared their public notebook, where they shared their learning curve, what they were working on, what help they needed, what they were reading. Nobody visited these things, absolutely no one. And as a result, all our correspondents became very demotivated, and of course they didn't update them, so the idea fell completely flat on their face. Members just don't want to visit that kind of destination page. It's not useful for them. What we learned is to meet readers where they are. So we changed tack, and we actually introduced individual newsletters for correspondents. Very simple idea. This is an example from Talia, who is our mobility correspondent. Every correspondent has their own newsletter. They reach members directly in their inbox about the projects they're working on, the help they need, and the feedback loop is much, much easier. You can just hit reply. So we've really done away with those destination pages ideas. This is probably the biggest mistake we've made overall. We tried to do too much with too little, and it's had a huge impact on our organization. We've had a burnout problem within the organization. We've had a loss of focus and a lack of resources to go to the things that are really important to us, which is sustaining member relationships. A good example of where we've tried to do things that we just don't have the time for is events. Events are lovely to do. Loads of media organizations do them. But as people who run them and who run them well will know, it's almost like running a second company to run a successful events. For us, especially when they involved writers, they involved writers preparing for the events, traveling to events, obviously presenting, dealing with the feedback, and all of this took away from the actual business of writing and being engaged with members. And what we found was it really reached a small group of people in a not particularly meaningful way, and it never brought us any new members either. It wasn't helping us reach new people. So we've really scaled back on events this year to really focus on other engagement efforts. It doesn't mean we won't ever do them again, but for now, we realize it's okay to say no, even if the things that we're doing are fun and feel innovative as well. All of our writers are given loads of room to run. We talked about that at the top of the session. They can decide what they're reporting on. We don't assign pitches in any way. But what that has meant for us is that writers can feel really, really isolated. And although we've tried to empower them as much as possible, this can lead to them feeling quite abandoned, especially when they're deep in a piece. We're still working on ways to try and make this a little bit better. How can we bring them into a really cohesive team? Because we were really excelling in collaborating with members, but we don't actually excel that well in collaborating internally with our team members. So we're really trying to make this better. Really simple thing, like we have a writer's room that we've now created within our office space, but there are other ways we know that we can try and improve this, and we're still working on ideas for how to make this particular thing better. Building cool tools isn't enough was a lesson that we learned very recently when we built something that's really cool called our member Rolodex. One of our founders, Ernst Jan, is going to talk about this at a session here on Saturday. But we know that our members know more than we do. So we've built a tool to help correspondents take advantage of that. We have, if a member is an oncologist, for example, we verify that member in that area of expertise, and we have them in the Rolodex so that if a correspondent is working on a story about cancer treatments, they can find people easily who are able to help with expert proofreading, expert fact-checking, or perhaps providing context and also leading conversations after the piece is published. This is a really great tool. We've had it for a few months. No one uses it. When it is used, it's not being used properly. I know Maaike won't mind me sharing this with you because she would have shared it with you when she came, if she was able to come today. We had a story a few months back about polio. We had a really an eminent immunologist in our Rolodex. She was like, I'm going to do it. No one's using it. Let's do it now. She sent the piece to him. The piece was in such a poor state before it got to him that the edits he provided were purely based on style and spelling, and he didn't use any of his expert knowledge. And Maaike just hadn't thought through what stage in the editorial process we were actually just wanted to use the cool tool. And it's a really 101 mistake to make. And so we're doing a couple of things to try and make this better and easier, which includes being specific with our staff about how we want to conduct engagement, not just with members. This is another thing that will probably be familiar to people here. We're proud of the contribution section that we have, but what we often find is that the majority of the names in the contribution section for a lot of our articles are male. And when Membership Puzzle Project was speaking with the Correspondent members, they did speak to a number of female members who said that they were reluctant to contribute because they were concerned about being questioned or attacked. They also, not just women, other groups were concerned about feeling that the quality of what they had to contribute wasn't high enough. And people were also concerned about privacy and using their real names and giving their expertise if it put them at risk. So we really need to make our contribution spaces inviting for everyone. And this is a mistake that we're still trying to rectify. One of the ways we're trying to do that is that we recently appointed a new role, which is our conversations editor. Her name's Van Martel. She's here this week. And one of her key roles is going to be inviting underrepresented groups into those contribution spaces to try and make sure that, especially when conversations are going on around issues, that the people who are living those issues are actually talking about those issues. So that's a really key part of her new role. And we're also looking at features, very technical ways that we can try to make the comment space more inviting. But we're a long way from getting this right, and we'd be really interested to talk to others who are dealing with this problem and working in this space, because we think there's a good chance we can solve this in a collaborative fashion. And this is the last lesson. About a year ago, our founder, Rob Weinberg, walked into the office and he said, I have a new proposal for the way we're going to organize salaries. So everyone see his pricks up. And he said, everyone is going to set their own salaries from now on. It's like, awesome. The theory behind this is that everybody sets their salaries based on their personal need. The business will have a salary budget. When people set their salaries, we add all of their dream amounts up, and the percentage by which the collective amount is over the budget, everyone's dream amount is reduced by that percentage. So people are unlikely to get what they asked for, but they're likely to get much closer to it than they would otherwise. Cool idea. Really fits with our philosophy for The Correspondent as a flat organization that really believes in self-determination. But it was a complete disaster. It brought up all sorts of issues and emotions that we hadn't really realized were there. Even if you have a flat structure in your organization, there's stuff people don't talk about. And a lot of people came to the fore with things that we didn't know that they felt. The people who said that they would ask for a pay rise said that, well, if I ask for a pay rise, aren't I taking money out of my colleagues' pockets? And the people at the top end of the salary scale said, well, if I don't take a pay cut, then I'm also taking money out of my colleagues' pockets, but I don't want to do that. And it just became completely unworkable. On top of that, we were also dealing with the burnout issue I talked about earlier. So it was really exacerbating the stress that people were feeling within the organization. I spoke to Rob yesterday about, could I tell you this? And also, what advice would he give around this? He said, this is a great idea, and people in principle supported the idea. But number one, if you're going to do this while the sun is shining. Do this while everybody is in a position where they feel stable enough to take on what is quite an emotional conversation. And the other thing is, be prepared that this might not work. We actually talked about this with Jasper, with the psychosocial therapist, and he said he'd worked with several organizations who have tried this, and he's never found a way to make it work. So innovation in theory is very different to innovation in practice. So those are some of the things we learned. Those are some of the mistakes that we've made. As I say, there are many others, and I'd be really happy to talk them through at a later stage with people. But if anybody has any questions on those lessons or anything else, I'll be happy to take them. Yep.
Is it on? Yes. Really? Okay. Could you elaborate on number 7, that you try to don't make writers feel abandoned? Because I imagine it's really hard, because it's also my own experience. If you're very specialized, you don't really have any other people to talk to you about this topic and to reflect. So you said you have some more ideas. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, for sure. So we do have, obviously we have editorial meetings like any news organization. We're trying to see where we can pair writers up with each other if they have overlapping beats, as it were. That can help them to feel like they have support. And so we have a progress correspondent who reports on all sorts of different economic measures, the way the world is changing, and we also have an economics reporter. They're a really good match to kind of bounce ideas off each other, and actually when I sit in a room and listen to them talk, it's wonderful but scary. And so to try and encourage those kind of partnerships is one thing. We can look better, I think, at mentoring for our writers. As I say, we want to empower them, but we also want them to feel supported. So I think we can look at that much, much better as well. And also this idea of like a community of practice, not just within the Correspondent, but outside of it. So are there other reporters working in the same beat and in the same field that they can come together with that help them feel supported? As I say, getting writers in the office has been one of the simplest things we could do. They often work at home or they're traveling, but actually bringing people into the office on a regular basis has been one of the simplest things we could do. But it's tough, and especially because people have to travel, they have to be out there on their own. So yeah, kind of building extra or support networks for them.
Hi, my name is Eva and I'm from Finland. I'm interested in the topic you told about your journals, that they are very specialized, and you even have a cyclist journalist or something like that. And for me it sounds like the good old days of journalism. So I'm interested in how it is in reality. How do the journalists pick up the field that they follow? Don't you define it anyway, the bosses don't take part in it at
Well,
all.
we really don't. It's a little bit like the quartz model of obsessions, following your obsessions. So when a writer comes to us, they usually have an area that they're really interested in, and they have an expertise that they either already have or they want to develop. We either give them the space to develop that, or we give them the space to take that further. Usually, our correspondents, they have a mission. So they have kind of a broad statement about the type of understanding they want to add to their field or to the world. So they have to kind of have a framework that it sits in. You can't just say, I want to write about cycling, and we say, yes, please, go off. Talia has, she wants to look at how transport policy fits with sustainability goals, how it fits with municipal planning. She kind of has an idea for the way her stories will be framed. But it really is self-defined, and it also evolves. So Talia is a really good example. She started off as a kind of mobility correspondent, so looking very specifically at transport. But she's actually, as she's developed her stories and moved through different iterations of them, she's actually now found that what she's really interested in is urbanism, is modern cities and how they support modern life. So her beat has changed and evolved over time. And that's the really nice thing about them being self-defined and them choosing what they want to write about in collaboration with the members, is that that evolution can happen. But we really do give them the power to decide. Yeah.
Do the journalists get some kind of bonuses, or do you measure how popular their stories are, how engaged your members are to tell their stories?
Yeah, measures of success is an interesting one. So because we have a data minimization policy, we don't track and we don't have bonuses in that way. Like, we don't say you have to get X number of uniques or page views per person. We look at impact. So did it result in a change in a particular movement? Did it result in a change in a piece of legislation? So we try to look at impact over and above page views. I mean, as I say, we're supported by members, so we don't have to chase those kind of metrics. Those things aren't important to us. But yeah, we're pushing for journalism as the starting point for change. So impact becomes more important when we think about it in that frame.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Antonia. I was wondering about your contribution section you were talking about earlier, and you said that you have certain ideas of engaging minority groups, and I didn't really follow so far, because what you were saying, if I got it right, was that you have a certain person who tries to engage the members more. How do you do that? Because I feel it's still quite hard for them to speak up if it's this open environment that's not changing and there's all that expertise out there on certain specialized topics. So how does that person try to engage the other members?
Yeah, and that's the question we're trying to answer at the moment. So this is a super new role that we've just brought in. What Gwen will try to do is to invite people in. So if we're reporting on the trans community, for example, she would work with either trans rights activist groups or people who are leaders in that field, and she will bring them into the conversation. So they would have a free membership for a month to act as a conversation leaders in that space. So to actively actually, it's not just saying you could comment on this story, in Twitter with the right hashtag. It's a direct relationship and providing help and support on the type of contributions they could provide. How that works in practice is still up for debate, and the effectiveness of it. So we're really excited about it. It's a really interesting role for Gwen to take on. How that works in practice is a different thing, and it also has to work in combination with design features that make conversation feel welcoming. We've talked about, because we don't want people to just grandstand and give opinions, we want them to give expertise and experiences. How can we point them to do that? But this is something that we're only just starting to work on, and I think I would hope we'd be able to come back in a year and talk about whether we have got this right or wrong. But it's going to be a big challenge. It's a challenge that everyone in the industry is working on. So it will be interesting to see how we can make some headway with that. But I think we're still very early days. I think we're done. Okay, cool. We haven't got any time for any more questions, but I'll be around if anybody wants to come and talk to me directly. I'd be really happy to speak to you. Thanks so much for not only listening, but putting yourselves out there today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.